Hello, friends. Friends, ever wonder what philosophers want to tell us? Well, friends, today we are going to discuss about the philosophical wisdom. We are going to unpack the core messages that 100 philosophical books want to share with us. Well, these are the ideas that authors spend their lives to trying to share with us. So, friends, why does this matter? Because, friends, philosophy isn't just for academics or for deep thinkers, it's for everyone who is ever asked this question: why are we here? Or what's the point of it all? These books hold answers, or at least the thought provoking ideas. So let's start with the basics. Philosophy is about asking questions and seeking understanding. It's not about finding definitive answers. Sometimes it's about the journey of thinking itself. Now, friends, let's dive into some of these core messages. First up, we have the idea of know the self. This comes from ancient Greek philosophy. It's about self awareness and understanding our nature. Well, why is this important? Because when we understand ourselves, we make better decisions, we relate better with others, we live more authentic lives. Moving on, let's talk about ethics. Many philosophers have grappled with the questions: what is right and wrong? Some say it's about maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people. Others argue it's about following moral rules. No matter the consequences, there is no easy answer. But thinking about these questions help us to navigate tough choices. Next, we have the concept of reality. Is what we see and the experience is real? Well, Plato suggested that what we perceive is just a shadow of true reality. This idea has influenced thinkers for centuries. It makes us question on our assumption about the world around us. Now, let's shift gears to talk about the freedom. Many philosophers have explored what it means to be truly free. Some say it's about making our own choices. Others argue that true freedom comes from understanding our places in the universe. Well, this idea connects to how we think about responsibility and the society. Well, speaking of society, let's discuss social contact theory. Well, this is the idea that we agree to follow the rule for the good for everyone. Well, it's a foundation of modern political thought. It makes us think about our rights and the responsibilities as a citizen. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Some philosophers say we can only trust what we experience directly. Others argue that reason and the logic are the key to understand. This debate has shaped how we think about science and the education. Well, time is another big topic in the philosophy. Well, it or is it linear or does it loop? Does the future already exist? These questions might seem abstract, but they affect how we live our lives. They influences how we think about goals, regrets, and possibilities. Now, friends, let's talk about the meaning of life. Many philosophers have tackled this big question. Some say it's about happiness, others argue it's about fulfilling our purposes. Some even suggested that life has no inherent meaning and we must create our own. Well, related to this is the concept of happiness. What does it means to live a good life? Is it about pleasure, virtue, or something else entirely? Now, friends, let's consider the nature of the self. Are we the same person throughout our life? How much can we change and still be us? This connects to the idea about personal growth and our identity. Now, let's move on to the concept of beauty. What makes something beautiful? Is beauty in the eyes of beholder or are there universal standard? This affects how we think about art, nature and even ourselves. Now let's consider the nature of language. How does it shape our thoughts? Can we think without words? Well, these ideas influences how we communicate and understand each other. Now friends, let's talk about the mind body problem. Are our minds separate from our bodies? Well, this question has an implication for how we think about consciousness and even artificial intelligence. Well, speaking of which, let's consider the nature of consciousness. What does it mean to be aware? Could machine ever be truly conscious? These questions are becoming increasingly relevant in our technological age. Now let's move on to the concept of free will. Do we really make our own choices or are we determined to outside forces? Well, this idea affects how we think about responsibilities and the moral judgment. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of truth. Is there a such thing as absolute truth or is everything is a relative? Well, this debate has huge implication for how we approach knowledge and the ethics. Friends, let's consider the idea of progress. Is humanity getting better over time or are we just changing, not improving? This affects how we view history and plan for the nature. Now friends, let's talk about the nature of existence itself. Well, why is there something rather than nothing? This might seems like an impossible question, but it's one that's fascinated thinkers for centuries. Now let's move on to the concept of morality. Where do our ideas of a right and the wrong comes from? Are they universe or do they vary by culture? This affects how we judge action and make ethical decisions. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of love. What is it? Is it an emotion, a choice, or something else entirely? This idea shapes how we form relationship and understand human connections. Now, let's talk about the concept of authenticity. What does it means to be truly yourself? How do we balance social expectation with personal desire? This idea is crucial for understanding identity and self expression. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of creativity. Where do new ideas come from? Can creativity be learned or cultivated? Well, this affects how we approach problem solving and the innovations. Now, let's move on to the concept of equality. What does it mean for people to be equal? How do we balance equality with the individual differences? These questions are at the heart of many social and the political debates. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of good and the evil. Are people inherently good, bad, or neutral? How do we explain act of kindness and the cruelty? This idea shapes how we view human nature and the morality. Now, let's consider the concept of infinity. Can we truly comprehend something without end? How does this idea affects our understanding of the universe? Well, this connects to how we think about limits and the possibilities. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of change. Is change constant, or are there unchanging aspect of reality? Well, how do we navigate a world that's always in flux? This idea affects how we approach stability and the adaptation. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of purpose. Do things happen for the reason, or is the universe indifferent to our existence? This idea shapes how we find meaning in our experiences. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of human rights. Are there universal rights that apply to all people? How do we debate individual rights with the collective needs? Well, these questions are crucial for understanding ethics and the politics. Now, let's talk about the concept of wisdom. What makes someone wise? Is it a knowledge, experience, or something else? This idea affects how we value different type of understanding. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of faith. What a role does a belief play in our lives? How do we balance faith with reason? This idea shapes how we approach religion and the spirituality. Now let's consider the concept of legacy. What do we leave behind when we are gone? How does this shape our action in the present? Well, this concept to how we think about our impact on the world. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of perception. How much can we trust our senses? How do our expectation shapes what we perceive? This idea affects how we understand reality and our places in it. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of individuality. What makes each person unique? How do we balance individual expression with social coherence? Well, this idea shapes how we think about identity and the community. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of rationality. What does it mean to be a rational? Is a pure logic always be approach to understanding? Well, this affects how we make decisions and solve problems. Now, let's talk about the concept of destiny. Is our future predetermined, or do we shape it with our choices? How does this idea affects how we live our lives? Well, this connects to how we think about responsibilities and the possibilities. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of art. What makes something a work of art? How does art reflect and shape culture? This idea affects how we express ourselves and understand creativity. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of human nature. Are there universal traits that all humans share? How much are we shaped by nature versus nurture? This idea influences how we understand behavior in the society. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of time. Is time is a fundamental part of reality, or just a human construct? How does our perception of time affects our lives? This connects to how we think about the past, present, and the future. Now, friends, let's consider the concept of justice. What does a truly just society look like? How do we balance fairness with other values? Well, this idea shapes how we approach law and the social organization. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What's the difference between knowledge and the belief? This affects how we approach learning and the understanding. Now, let's move on to the concept of tolerance. What does it mean to be truly accept differences? How do we balance tolerance with our own belief? Well, this idea shapes how we interact with a diverse perspective. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of reality. Is there a objective reality or is everything is a subjective? Now, let's talk about the concept of virtue. What makes a person good? How do we cultivate positive traits? This idea affects how we think about character and the ethics. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of language. How does language shape our thoughts? Can we think about things we don't have words exist for that? Well, this affects how we communicate and understand a word. Now, let's consider the concept of beauty. Is beauty objective or subjective? How does our idea of beauty affects our lives? This connects to how we approach art, nature, and even ourselves. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of emotions. What are emotions? How do they relate to reason and the decision makings? Well, this idea shapes how we understand ourselves and the others. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of truth. Is there such thing as absolute truth? How do we determine what's the truth? Well, this affects how we approach knowledge and the beliefs. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of free will. Do we make our own choices? How does this idea affect how we think about responsibilities? Well, this connects to how we understand human behavior and the morality. Now, friends, let's talk about the concept of identity. What makes you as a you? How much can we change and still be ourselves? Well, this idea shapes how we think about ourselves and personal growth. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of causality. Does everything happens for the reason? How do we understand cause and the effects or effects? Well, this affects how we approach science and the everyday reasoning. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of happiness. What does it means to be truly happy? Is happiness is a goal or a byproduct of how we live? Next, let's talk about the nature of ethics. Where do our moral value comes from? How do we decide what's right and the wrong? Well, this affects how we make decisions and judge actions. Now, let's consider the concept of power. What gives someone power over others? How should power be used responsibly? Well, this idea shapes how we understand politics and the social dynamics. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What's the relationship between knowledge and the wisdom? This affects how we approach learning and the understanding. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of freedom. What does it mean to be truly free? How do we balance personal freedom with the social responsibilities? Well, this idea shapes how we think about right and the obligations. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of reality. Is what we perceive really what exists? How do our minds shape our experiences of reality? Well, this affects how we understand the world around us. Now, friends, let's talk about the concept of justice. What makes a society just? How do we balance different ideas of fairness? Well, this shapes how we approach law and social organization. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of love. What is love? How does it relate to other emotions and the experiences? This affects how we form relationship and the understand human connections. Now, let's move on to the concept of meaning. What gives life meaning? How do we find purpose in our existence? Well, this idea shapes how we approach our goals and the values. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of consciousness. What does it mean to be fully aware? Could machine ever be truly conscious? Well, this affects how we understand our mind and artificial intelligence. Now let's consider the concept of progress. Are things getting better over time? How do we measure improvement in a society? Well, this idea shapes how we view society and plan for future. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of art. What makes something a work of art? How does art reflect and the shape culture? Well, this affects how we express ourselves and understand creativity. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of beauty. What makes something beautiful? How does our idea of beauty affects our lives? Well, this idea shapes our approach towards art, nature, and even ourselves. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of morality. Where do our ideas of rights and wrongs come from? Are moral values universal or culturally relative? Well, this affects how we make ethical decisions and the judge actions. Now, let's consider the concept of identity. What makes you as a you? How much can we change and still be ourselves? This idea shapes how we think about personal growth and authenticity. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of reality. Is there an objective reality or is everything is a subjective? How does this idea affects how we understand the truth? Well, this affects how we approach science and personal experiences. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of happiness. What does it mean to be truly happy? Is happiness is a goal or a byproduct of how we live? This idea shapes how we approach life and measure success. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of power. What gives someone power over others? How should power be used responsibly? Well, this affects how we understand politics and social dynamics. Now, friends, let's talk about the concept of freedom. What does it mean to be truly free? How do we balance personal freedom with social responsibilities? This idea shapes how we think about a right and the obligations. Now, friends, let's consider the nature of love. What is love? How does it relate to other emotions and the experiences? This affects how we form a relationship and understand human connections. Now, friends, let's move on to the concept of meaning. What gives a life meaning? How do we find purpose in our existence? This idea shapes how we approach our goals and the values. Now, friends, let's talk about the nature of consciousness. What does it mean to be aware? Could machine ever be truly conscious? This affects how we understand our minds and artificial intelligence. So, friends, we have covered a lot of ground today. These are just a few of the core messages from philosophical books. Well, each one could be a whole video on itself. So, friends, what do you think about these ideas? Which one resonate with you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting, give the video a like and help others to find this content too. Well, don't forget to subscribe for more mind bending philosophical discussion. Until next time, keep questioning and stay curious.